Greetings and welcome to another episode of Businesstalk podcast. I'm your host Deepak from India. I'm honored to welcome Dr. Ashwini Deshpande, Head of the Department and Professor of Economics at Ashoka University, as our distinguished guest on today's podcast. Dr. Deshpande is also the founding director of the Center for Economic Data and Analysis at Ashoka University. Her academic journey began with a PhD focus on the international debt crisis of the 1980s, before turning towards her long-standing research interest in the economics of discrimination and affirmative action, particularly the intersections of caste and gender in India. Dr. Deshpande has published extensively in leading international journals and is the author of Grammar of Caste, Economic Discrimination in Contemporary India and Affirmative Action in India. She has also edited several influential volumes, including the Handbook on Economics of Discrimination and Affirmative Action. Her contributions to the field have been recognized through numerous honors, including the Exim Bank Award for Outstanding Dissertation, the V.K.R.V. Rao Award for Indian Economist under 45, and the Scotch Award for Gender Economics. She is also a fellow of the International Economic Association. In this episode, Dr. Ashwini Deshpande shares thought-provoking insights from her edited volume, Handbook on Economics of Discrimination and Affirmative Action. So without further delay, let's welcome Dr. Ashwini Deshpande to the podcast. Dr. Deshpande, thank you for graciously accepting our invitation. It's truly an honor and privilege to have you with us today.
Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm delighted to be here.
Thank you. Professor, your introduction to the handbook frames the challenges of bringing together Western theoretical frameworks and Indian philosophical writings on discrimination and social justice. How did you decide to integrate these two traditions, and what do you see as the most significant insights arising from just posing them?
You are right that the original plan was, in fact, to juxtapose these two strands of writing, because I believe that as far as discrimination is concerned, or even the idea of women's equality, which we know as feminism, but really that was not the name that was given in ancient in sort of historical different types of writings and thoughts that came out of India. So I wanted to emphasize that these ideas of anti-discrimination or equality between all individuals, regardless of their birth, etc., these originated in the Indian subcontinent centuries before they actually started. You start seeing them in Western democracies, so feminism, etc., you start seeing it for the first time in the 19th century. Whereas if you look at the poetry of the Bhakti movement, for example, it's 8, 9, 10 centuries from different parts of the Indian subcontinent, you see this idea of equality between caste groups, between genders, etc., articulated very significantly. And then, of course, in the more recent times, thinkers and scholars and leading figures such as Mahatma Phule from Maharashtra, B.R. Ambedkar, Dr. Ambedkar from Maharashtra, Periyar from Tamil Nadu, many others have significantly written about and thought very deeply about the idea that your birth should not determine your station in life, whether it is your occupational choices, whether it is status, whether it is respect, that cannot be determined by which caste or group you are born into. And so originally, I definitely wanted a large section in the handbook, which would bring to the Western readers particularly, or also to Indian readers, because even in India, in the academic sphere, you don't really, not everybody is exposed equally to these ideas and to these writings. But what happened with the handbook was that it started to take shape during the pandemic. Although the plan for the handbook was laid out before the pandemic, when I started approaching authors, the COVID pandemic hit. And that affected the submissions significantly. So many topics on which I wanted contributions and to which authors had agreed ultimately were not able to deliver. And that was such a traumatic time for individuals across the globe that people were in very difficult circumstances, and life had just turned upside down. And so in the end, I had to go with the contributions that I got. So several chapters, not just about the Indian thought, but also, for example, on discrimination based upon sexual orientation, There were going to be a couple of chapters on that, and unfortunately, those didn't see the light of day. And I couldn't wait to find new authors because, then those who had submitted on time, it's really not fair to them. And there comes a time when you feel that, okay, I have enough material now. And obviously, these things are never complete in that sense. I mean, there can always be so many dimensions that we could look at. And so I think that was, in the end, that's what ended up being. But I did want to make that point, which is, and I do make it wherever I get a chance, which is that many ideas that we think of today, of equality, particularly in various dimensions, that we think today as coming to us from the West, that it's really scholars and thinkers in Western democracies that for the first time thought of equality, the notion of equality is not really true at all. While there is a significant history of inequality in the Indian subcontinent, there is also equally a challenge to these ideas of inequality, and a very significant and very articulate challenge that we've seen through the centuries.
Very insightful. Professor, the section analyzing discrimination and disadvantage includes classic approaches like caste-based discrimination and stratification economics. In your view, to what extent do these theoretical models remain relevant in the global South context, especially in India, and where might they need adaptation?
So stratification economics is actually a new field that combines insights into from some of the more traditional fields, such as theories such as taste for discrimination, statistical discrimination. These are the two main theories that economists have used since the late 1950s, when Kenneth Arrow talked about statistical discrimination, Gary Becker talked about taste-based discrimination, and there have been many critiques of these ideas as well. But I think that there is really no one theory that can explain different nuances of discrimination, be it in the global north or in the global south. Certainly in the global south, the challenges are many more, and particularly in the Indian subcontinent, because the kind of caste system that you see in the Indian subcontinent is very different from what people think of as the caste system. So there's this very famous book called Caste by Isabel Wilkerson, where she really talks about the racial inequality in the United States and calls it a caste system. I see the logic of doing that, and I can kind of see why she's doing it. But really, the nuances of the way in which the caste system operates in the Indian subcontinent are very, very different in many dimensions. Of course, the outcomes of racism or the outcomes of casteism towards those who are at the bottom of the hierarchy, those are similar. So they face similar outcomes. But just because they face similar outcome doesn't make the system similar. And so I think I recently was at an NBER conference on race and stratification economics. And I made the point there, which is that while we must see similarities, we also have to appreciate that there are many differences in which particularly non-color based systems of stratification, which is one example of which is the caste system, operate. Because I think the way in which they operate is in some sense more intriguing, and therefore eliminating caste-based discrimination in some sense is more challenging because it's not as visually ascriptive as the racial divisions are. You see a man in the street or a woman in the street, you're not going to be able to determine their caste. You can determine some things, like maybe from their accent, you can determine which part of India they come from. By how they dress, you can determine their class status. And there is an overlap between caste and class, but you cannot immediately look at the person and say, oh, here's a Brahmin walking, right? Unless they have some visual markers like, a particular, like the Bodhi or something like that. So there can be other markers in terms of dress and appearance that can give a clue. Even surnames are not always indicative of caste, which makes it actually quite mysterious about how caste continues to operate in urban settings where it's much more anonymous. And so I think that statistical discrimination or taste-based discrimination offer insights, although they are market-based theories. So again, the challenge for a context like India is where a lot of interactions happen in not necessarily in a monetized setting. It's not completely a market-based interaction. There are elements of a market-based interaction, but there are also elements of informality. There's the rural setting where the employer knows the employee already. There's no question of guessing the caste, the person knows it. And also in informal markets, a lot of hiring is done through contractors that actually do caste-based hiring. So they will look at a particular jati for a particular kind of job. So if they want to recruit masons, they will go to a particular group. If they want to recruit bricklayers, they will go to another group, etc., etc. Agricultural jobs, a whole range of jobs in the informal economy are determined this in this way. So what we see in models of statistical and taste-based discrimination, those are applicable, by the way, to the modern sector in our economy with 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 certain limitations. I On the question of knowledge, I have a view that we shouldn't shut down knowledge just because it's coming from one context or the other. So I think knowledge coming from all different sources, parts of the world, periods can be useful, depends on what the knowledge is. And so I think that as scholars and as practitioners, we need to be open-minded. That's how the knowledge base expands, right? So just because it's coming from India, everything is correct, and just because something is coming from the West, everything is wrong. I do not subscribe to this binary. And so I will examine each piece of knowledge in its own terms and examine the validity or not of that particular insight. And if I believe that it's valid, I will use it in my work. And if I believe it's invalid, I will not use it in my work. So you see a lot of theories, arguments, propositions coming from scholars based in India, which with I don't agree, right? So I think you have to. I would say, as a scholar, I think the fundamental role of being a scholar is to be exposed to different kinds of ideas and then choose the best out of these. And what this handbook is trying to do is to make a lot of that canvas available to scholars from the global north as well as from the global south. Um, and I can see the point of your question, which is that sometimes we say, oh, because it's coming from America and because it's coming from England or France or whatever, it must be right, right? I don't think that's true either. But just because it's coming from America or England or France, it's therefore wrong. That's not right either, right? So I think we need to be creative. We need to be engaging with different streams of knowledge that are coming our way, and take the best of both and also critique.
Professor, a substantial part of the book is devoted to methodological advances, decompositions and field experiments, big data and mixed methods. Which methodological advance do you personally believe is most underutilized in studies of discrimination and affirmative action, and why?
So overall, the first point I think we need to understand is that measuring discrimination or estimating the quantum of discrimination is always controversial, right? Because when you think about it at an individual level, right? Supposing I go to a restaurant and I am not seated properly, the waiter doesn't pay attention to me, or I go into a shop and somebody is following me nonstop, obviously keeping an eye on whether I'm going to, whether I'm going to be an honest shopper or not. At an airport, supposing I get picked up more, a lot of the times when I'm flying for a body search, right? Is this happening because I'm a brown skinned person in a majority white country or not, right? And you cannot 100% say, unless some really racist word is being said to me on the face, you so and so, get out of here or something like that, unless there is a very clear situation like that. I cannot say whether I got picked up because of my skin color, right? Supposing I am shoplifting, right? I go into a shop and I am actually stealing and I get caught. I also happen to be brown skinned. Is that discrimination or is that a legitimate arrest because I was shoplifting? Right? So what I'm trying to say is that where does race or caste or gender legitimately enter as a factor for being discriminated? What is discrimination? It means you're being unfairly treated on account of that one attribute, right? I'm as good as a male peer, but I will not get promoted because I'm female. That is discrimination. If I'm not as good as my male peer and I don't get promoted, not necessarily discrimination. It could be, but that's where the gray area enters. right? So to give you a more obvious example, supposing you look at the average salaries of people who have studied up to class 12, all right, and the average salaries of people who have done an MBA, which group will earn more? What is your answer?
Yeah, the first one.
No, average salaries of people who've done up to class 12, who've
Yeah.
studied up to class 12, and
Yes.
salaries that have salaries of people who finished an MBA.
Correct. MBA one,
MBA
definitely.
ones will earn more, right? And
Yes.
you wouldn't think that's discrimination. You'll
Yes.
say, well, they studied more, they have better educational qualifications, so they earn more. Now, supposing you find that supposing men tend to do MBA more in greater proportions than women do, and women, supposing, drop out after class 12, right? And now you see average wages of men and women. Yes, there are differences in male female wages, but it is also the case that men have educated are more educated than women. So somebody might say, an employer might say, well, I just paid an MBA person a higher salary than I paid a class 12 person. It happened to be the case that the class 12 person was female and the MBA person was male, right? So now it becomes more complicated. Is it discrimination or is it gender? Of course, you can say, why is it that women are not doing MBA? There could be some discrimination there. So establishing discrimination takes many different steps and many different layers, and it's complicated, right? So the challenge in start measuring discrimination is, how do you separate the differences that are arising from genuine, uh, you know, educational achievement, or actual, like, if somebody else is smarter than I am, and there are many people smarter than I am, then if they are doing better than I am, then somebody might say, well, that's not discrimination, that's just those people are smarter than you are, so that's why they're doing better, right? So how do you distinguish ability, merit, scores, etc., etc., and also then go historically? Why is it that certain sections tend to have lower educational attainment? Because they get a worse, from childhood they face a lot of disadvantage. So you have to then factor in disadvantage that happens in access to schooling, in access to healthcare, in access to food, etc., etc. So I'm saying all these things because you realize the minute you put thought into figuring out what is discrimination versus what are gaps not due to discrimination, then the story becomes really complicated. And so I think all these methods have a place. So you need to look at average wage gaps, and the decomposition method does exactly what I described a little while ago, which is what part of the wage gap is because of differences in educational degrees, merit, ability, etc., and what part of the wage gap cannot be explained. Mixed methods is both database, but also you go into the field, you study the field, you understand the context, you do some ethnographic interviews, etc. And field experiments are also extremely important. There's a very, very famous field experiment that has now been replicated in many contexts. It started in the United States, where fictitious resumes were sent to employers. And the only thing that was different on those resumes were names of employees, where they use stereotypically white names and stereotypically black names. And so the employer is not looking at the person, just looking at a CV. Now, if all the hiring is meritocratic, if employers say, well, we don't really care about race, we want to hire the best person, then for a particular job, people with identical CVs, all of them should have been called back, or none of them should have been called back. So either all of them are qualified or none of them are qualified, right? You should not see within identical CVs, you should not see a gap between male and female or black and white. And guess what? They actually found that white applicants, just based upon their CVs, got many more callback offers. Callback is not a job guarantee, but it's like, oh, we want to talk to you. Got many more callback offers than black applicants. And this paper is called, "Are Emily and Greg more employable than Lakisha or Jamal?" Right? And this is showing discrimination at its purest form, because there is really nothing that there's no reason to not call back the black employees unless you really are, have a discriminatory, you are discriminating against them. So this is before the job is offered. right? So this you could not have seen in the wage data because these people, many of these people never got offered. These people were not real. So there is discrimination even at the point where employers consider who to invite for interviews. And if they systematically invite black applicants fewer times than they do white applicants, then that's going to then reflect in the actual employment data, right? So field experiments, and there are many other, absolutely brilliant field experiments. So field experiments have their own role because they bring out features that you cannot find in big data. Big data has its advantage that it's actual outcomes. It's not an experiment, and it's data that's nationally available. And the mixed methods has yet another advantage, which is that it actually connects you to the people who are experiencing discrimination or are practicing discrimination. So what are the factors? What are the motivators? What what are the life circumstances that result in a phenomenon called discrimination? So I think all three have their place.
Professor, one chapter, Caste and Gender, directly addresses the Indian experience of discrimination by caste and gender. Drawing on that, the other chapters, how would you characterize the similarities and differences between discrimination dynamics in India and, say, US race-based discrimination or Brazilian race gender discrimination?
So there is a whole theory or a whole field of analysis which is called intersectionality, which is so basically the point that they make, which when for the first time when it was brought to everybody's attention, basically the point that was made was the following, which is that when you think of race, a black person and a white person, typically when people are thinking of black men and white men, right? When you think of gender, people are typically thinking of white men and white women, right? So you're thinking of gender gaps within the whites in some sense. So there's the whole thing of white feminism. And when you think of race, you're really thinking of racial gaps between men. So which category is not getting talked about at all? It's the black women, right? Because when people are talking race, they are talking about incarceration rates, jailing rates, etc., etc. Focuses on black men and white men. When you talk about gender, it's really the majority group is white in the US, so it's white men versus white women. So black women who have the double burden of both being black and female, right? Their disadvantage or discrimination against them gets compounded, and they get left out of conversations on race, and they get left out of conversations on gender. And so you need to look at intersectional groups in order to make sure that groups that are doubly or triply or multiply disadvantaged are getting talked about, right? And in India, we know that more than anywhere else because we have caste, we have religion, we have gender, we have location, rural, urban, we have metros and very backward rural areas, and so on. So there is a multiplicity of disadvantages or advantages, for that matter, that somebody could enjoy, right? So I think that this concept of intersectionality is really very useful. But again, if you think about the examples I gave earlier, applying that is complicated, and that it actually highlights the point that I made about methods earlier, which is you need to employ many different kinds of methods, or even if you personally don't in your research, you need to be open to research that's coming from different methodologies. Also linked to the point I made about knowledge systems earlier, which is I don't believe in shutting out a particular field of knowledge just because I don't do it. And you see a lot of that in the public discourse, which is, oh, I don't like this method, so I will discredit all studies that are coming from this method. Why? If a particular study is showing something useful, why not look at it? And some other study showing something else that's useful. So look at what the insight is rather than what the method is.
Professor, in the affirmative action section, you include empirical evidence on quotas, representation, and outcomes across countries. For example, South Africa, Malaysia, and India. In your judgment, What makes an affirmative action policy both effective and equitable? And conversely, what are the biggest risks or unintended consequences?
So it's a work in progress. Affirmative action is a work in progress. It is, you cannot say that any country has solved the issue. Affirmative action policies are highly controversial wherever they are adopted. And regardless of the form of affirmative action, as you know, if you look at South Africa or India or Malaysia or Brazil or United States, now of course they don't have, but earlier when they used to have, um, the method of implementing affirmative action was different everywhere. India had quotas, USA never had quotas. Malaysia has a 30% equity, Malays must get 30%. So it's in equity, it's actually in some sense a little stronger in a certain field. India doesn't have it for the private sector, etc. So there are differences in each context. But if you look at the opposition to affirmative action, it's identical. So people who say, "Oh, I support affirmative action in this form, but I would not support it in the other form," that argument doesn't really hold because it doesn't matter what the form is. People who want to oppose it will oppose it. Similarly, people who support it. I think that it is a very challenging policy to implement because one a feature of that policy should be that it should be easy to implement. Easy in the sense it should be clear cut. The more loopholes or ambiguities you introduce in the policy, the harder it becomes to implement because you will say, well, why did you do one thing here and not the other thing there? But equally, what ends up happening is that India, for example, has uniform rules for all public sector. All right. But supposing there's a court case against reservations in one place in India, that has implications for recruitment everywhere because the rule then has to be the same for everyone, right? So Delhi University, where I used to teach earlier, has seen this, where for 10, 12 years or something like that, not a single person was hired in the teaching positions because of a court case going on reservations about how to, allocate it. It's a very complicated policy to administer. So I think what has happened in India is that because of multiple groups wanting reservations or quotas for themselves, uh, the challenge of implementation has become enormous. It's become very unwieldy and extremely mechanical, right? And so implementing it in a practical sense is very, very difficult. I show it to my students. There is a 200 seat roster. So if you have 200 positions, so the next 200 positions, every position is clearly identified that this will go to non-reserved. This will be OBC disabled. This will be SC, etc., etc. Because there are multiple kinds of reservations. But then what that means is that if you don't get a candidate belonging to exactly that category, which encompasses different features, then you can't proceed with appointments. And we have vertical reservations, which is SC, ST, OBC, and EWS. And we have horizontal reservations, which is women, disability, war widows, domicile, sports, etc. So think of a matrix which is, has these vertical categories and then horizontal categories. It is extremely challenging. So then we also have to think about if the policy becomes challenging to implement, how do we, uh, what do we do about it? And Ambedkar, there, I always try to remember what Dr. Ambedkar said, because Dr. Ambedkar's view about the reservation policy was it should be for those who have suffered the stigma of untouchability for generations and for centuries. So he was very much in favor of just, keeping it to the former untouchables, which is the scheduled caste group, and then, of course, the scheduled tribe group, and to no other group really, So these are all conversations, but these are very difficult conversations because once a policy gets extended to a particular group, then withdrawing it becomes even more problematic. And having an open debate about these is also very, very difficult politically. So, there we are. So I think affirmative action everywhere is challenging. Of course, in the United States and is under complete attack right now. All diversity, equity, inclusion policies, affirmative action policies are completely under attack. In India, it's there is a dual thing. On the ground, people attack it, but in terms of the leadership of political parties, every political party supports it, right? But not necessarily the supporters. So it's a very complicated issue, and I think, again, my all my work is evidence based, and so I really think that a lot of this discussion is a lot of heat, not enough light. And what I'm trying to do through my work is, or what I try to incorporate, the chapters that I've chosen for the handbook are those that throw light on the topic, not heat. So they're not ideological pieces, either for or against, but they're basically showing, okay, this is what has worked, this is the evidence, and I think that's the way I would approach these debates.
Professor, many chapters discuss the role of large-scale data, experiments, and algorithms like big data, correspondence studies, and lab in the field. How do you see advances in data science and machine learning shaping future discrimination research? And what ethical issues should researchers be especially aware of?
I think machine learning has a lot of potential to uncover patterns of discrimination, but there is also another thing that we need to be aware of, which is called algorithmic bias. See, because machine learning is learning from data that is getting generated by our daily actions. So if there is bias either in favor of or against a particular group or a community, that gets reflected. That's how these models are training themselves, right? So for example, I tried this last year and I was showing it to my students. I said to one of the models, I think ChatGPT or which one, I can't remember. I said, show me a picture of a corporate office setting where everybody's working. Draw a picture of like that, right? Immediately, the first picture that came was white men in suits working in different things. Why did that happen? Obviously, because the model is trained in settings where, when you think of corporate leadership, that is dominated by white men. So algorithms are not free of bias. Algorithmic bias is a legitimate and genuine field of study, and many people are studying it. I'm not a computer scientist, so I mean, I cannot speak to the technique of it. But what the point is that these large language models are getting trained on our behaviors, right? And so I think there's a need for caution. So, for example, in the United States, there's already a lot of literature on judges who use AI to predict whether a particular offender, if you release that person from prison, will that person commit reoffend or not, right? And based on the algorithms, they tend to release white prisoners more often than they tend to release black prisoners, because the AI is trained on arrest data, and blacks get arrested more often. But it is not if you look at the data for reoffending, prisoners who got released but did, committed a crime again, it is not the case that black prisoners who get released reoffend in greater proportion than white prisoners, right? So that's an algorithmic bias. So then what should judges do? Should they use AI or should they not? There, one would urge caution. Okay, maybe the AI model is telling you something, release this prisoner or don't release this prisoner. But I think then you need to have sensitization training. You need to have anti-discrimination, kind of guidelines clearly. So are we making a mistake? Am I releasing a person who's likely to commit an offense again? And am I not releasing a person who will probably not commit an offense again because he may not have committed the first one, or may not to the degree that was assumed by the justice system? So the inherent biases of the justice system will get reflected in the algorithms that uh, judges are likely to use. And so one needs to have caution. So, for example, shopping data, women everywhere will tell you, and I can testify for that, which is when we go into social media, the ads that show up on our pages are for jewelry, for clothes, right? Whereas for men, you see much more of, different kinds of, invest your money in something, something, etc., right? It's not that I don't get any investment ads, but I get much more jewelry and clothing ads than investment ads, right? Um, and so, what if the algorithm knows that I'm female? Then the the real life data that is getting generated, will kind of feed, or you this also you can try. Actually, you can just ask ChatGPT to create a picture of a doctor and a nurse talking. Show me a picture of a doctor and a nurse. In more often than not, the doctor would be male and the nurse would be female, whereas there is absolutely no biological reason um, for the doctor. So it could be a female doctor with a male nurse, right? But you won't see that in the. So these are algorithmic biases. So I think while big data, which is data collected with very high frequency, with a very large volume, and with high velocity, which is like data getting collected, every nanosecond. Uh, AI and ML techniques are very useful in analyzing that data because no conventional kind of econometric techniques can do that. So I think data science is useful, but algorithmic bias is a very real thing. So again, need for caution there.
Dr. Deshpande, I would like to conclude this episode with one last question. Finally, if you were to pick a single takeaway message from the handbook for policymakers in India seeking to design or reform affirmative action programs, what would it be, and what's one misconception you would caution against?
A one line message from the book is that discrimination is real, that social identity matters in economic outcomes, and we need to be aware of it. And we need to make sure that whatever policies we design, whether it's affirmative action or any other kind of policy, we need to be sensitive to sources of discrimination and how we design systems that minimize it. Completely eliminating is maybe in some utopian future it might happen, but at the moment I think we need to work on systems that minimize it, while also encouraging initiative and creativity. You cannot, I don't think it's right to stifle creativity and initiative. But how do you minimize discrimination? uh, Misconception is that it's a completely meritocratic world. So people, if you haven't done well in the job market, it's because you deserve it, because you don't have the credentials, right? I don't think that's true. Uh, um, Neither the Indian labor market nor any other labor market in the world is truly meritocratic. So social identity, whether you're male or female, black or white, this caste or that caste, this religion or that religion, etc., all of these factors play a role over and above our intrinsic merit or our abilities, and also the way merit is produced. How do we get to study as much as we study? How do we get the scores that we get? What inputs were we, circumstances at birth over which we had no control? We got born into families, right? And who our parents were, what kind of wealth bracket did we get into, what was the kind of school that we went to, did we get well fed, did we live in a home that was, secure and not open to the elements, was there a threat of homelessness, was there a threat of malnutrition, do I worry about where my next meal is going to come from? All of these factors will affect my performance in school, and that will affect my degree, and that's going to affect my labor market outcomes. So therefore it's not only about intrinsic merit or intelligence. So labor markets everywhere are not meritocratic. So that is a big myth, I think, about labor markets, which we have to recognize. And so being aware of that will then make us think about what is the policy framework that we need to devise to minimize the risk of discrimination on account of the fact that labor markets are not meritocratic.
Thank you, Dr. Ashwini Deshpande, for sharing such insightful perspective on the economics of discrimination and affirmative action. It's been a truly enlightening discussion, and thank you for having with us today.
Thank you very much for having me. I really enjoyed talking to you.
Thank you.